Welcome back to the channel. It's been a little bit since we did a book review, so it's about time we pick it up because I am currently racing against time to finish the first Law series before my collector's editions copies arrive. So today we're going to talk about part 2 to the first Law series, Before They're Hanged. Let's start with just a quick plot summary because the last time we left off, our main party from the first book were heading off into the Old Empire. Bayaz and his crew were off to find something that it doesn't really reveal the details of. And along with that happening, you have another group that are off in the north fighting a war against Bethod and his soldiers, trying to reclaim the part of the north that was taken from our main empire in the story. And in the south, you have Glokta doing Glokta things and investigating a murder. So, our three main stories for this book are those plot lines. Now, what is interesting is there's actually quite a bit of a pickup in terms of the pacing between events in Before They Are Hanged from the first book. The first book, to me, was primarily a character and world-building book. This one actually moves quite quickly to move the plot forward. And while nothing is really fully resolved in this one, because it is part 2 of a 3-part trilogy, you definitely advance a lot of the stories and you actually learn a little bit more about the motivations of the characters involved and why they are doing what they're doing. The first book, I made a bit of a comparison between it and the Fellowship of the Ring portion of the Lord of the Rings stories. Granted, there's other things going on besides that, but I would say if you treat it as if the adventures of Bayaz and his little group are sort of the main focus, which I don't know that that's necessarily the case, but for that particular part of the story, it's a pretty apt comparison for the first book. The second book, on the other hand, would be if the trip to Mordor was a whole lot more interesting, because I don't know about you, but the part about the Lord of the Rings that I have the hardest time actually enjoying is just the portions where they're doing nothing but traveling. Well, the travel sections in this one are a lot more eventful, so there's way more going on, and it's very interesting seeing the situations that pop up. One sort of fun thing that happened was in the first book, I really liked Colonel West. By the end of it, started flipping a little bit. He did something that kind of irked me some. In the first book, I also wasn't particularly fond of Ferro, just because it seemed like she was really prone to going off at a trigger's notice. So, just to be clear, by the way, I'm not going to avoid spoilers for the first book. If you're watching a video on the second book, I'm just going to assume you've read the first book. So, Ferro was very volatile, hard to control. Even if it was very clear that they didn't want her to do something, she just had such mistrust, she would just go off and do whatever she wanted to do anyway. Well, the little flip with West's personality sort of towards the very end of the book, I feel like his adventure in this one, while it doesn't necessarily redeem him, let's say karma redeems him a little bit. Not going to really go too much into detail on that, but I will say of all the characters in the book, he probably has the most trials and tribulations in this one. Ferro, on the other hand, you actually get a decent chunk of perspective sections from her perspective. And the way she interacts with the other members of the group actually does kind of make you grow to get some fondness for her. It explains her actions. You get a little bit more of her backstory. You already knew she had a rough backstory, but when some of the details are fleshed out and you actually see how she can interact with people when she chooses to be around them for a while, she becomes a much more sympathetic character and a much more likable character. And I don't hate West, and I never really hated Ferro. I just felt like they were going to use her, or I felt like Abercrombie, I should say, instead of they, was going to use her as a bit of a plot contrivance to cause problems. Not really the case. Actually, she's a good bit the opposite of that. She's a little bit more of a problem solver rather than a problem causer in this one. She did cause some problems in the first book. That doesn't really keep going on in this, so if that irritated you like it did me, then don't worry. That part of the plot sort of fades off through character development, appropriate development. She doesn't just spontaneously start liking the rest of the group, by the way. That would be way too unrealistic for what I'm assuming is Abercrombie's style. which seems pretty grounded in trying to give the characters realistic interactions and reactions. I really like Abercrombie's style. I know people describe this as grimdark. This gets a bit grimmer and a little bit darker in terms of just the actual combat that happens and some of the things that happen to characters. But, yet again, if you're like me and grimdark mostly makes you think of things like Diablo or Warhammer, then this is probably still pretty on the light side by comparison. Yet again, that may change, but I would think it's more appropriate just to say this is a more grounded fiction and a more grounded world where things actually seem to follow more realistic consequences. I guess at least if you're a little bit of a cynic, they follow more realistic consequences. I don't see any sort of character interactions that I found wildly out of base or out of character. And I would actually argue it's harder to weave a good story when characters act realistically, because in fiction, a lot of the times you use a little bit of an unrealistic action to get people to do what you want them to do that's for the betterment of the story. This one doesn't really care if the characters actually get what they want. It puts things in a much more realistic perspective, which I guess is why people thrown it in the grimdark realm. At the time when these were originally coming out, that probably was just a little bit less common than what it is now. But overall, super enjoyable book. So, dove a little bit more into detail in terms of Bayaz's whole little crew, leaving some stuff out because there's a few characters involved in that it's really kind of fun to watch how they develop from the beginning of the book to the end. If we talk about West, yet again, tribulations, but you also get to see the Northman's chapters in his portion, which should make some sense. Towards the end of the first book, they kind of all hook up together. And so, I think it's towards the end of the first book, or is it the very beginning of this one? Those ending and beginning sections kind of bleed together. Pretty sure he meets them before the end of the first book. But those sections start to overlap, and so you get to see some good interactions there, and you get to be a little bit more familiar with Logan's old crew, which is interesting to see how they interact with things. They're a much more sort of traditional, I'd say, Viking-style character archetype. But of all the three sections in the book, for me personally, the ones dealing with the fight against Bethod was probably the least interesting. But it's like if you love chocolate and you've got three slight different variations of chocolate, asking which one is your least favorite. They're all good sections, but for me the least compelling were the sections involving the North. Just because they seem to sort of drag a little bit. They were interesting. There was one section that was super tense and very intense in terms of how everything played out. But a lot of it, I would say, felt slow because of the way that West is sort of being scoured and just taken through the paces, and watching that much sort of punishment being heaped on a person. Now, and not going to spoil what type. This is more of a psychological sort of thing. It can be difficult to get through in a decent pace and not feel oppressive as you're reading it. So, sure, I guess that falls into the grimdark stuff, but it's a bit of a different type of experience. Still good sections, not the best. My favorite, yet again, though, is Glokta, and I think that's at least largely because his sections seem to be a weird intersection between fantasy and detective. But he's a detective with zero morals. I would imagine if you like the Johannes Cabal series, you probably would like Glokta quite a bit, because Cabal is a similar character to Glokta. Watching Glokta's development is probably my favorite part of this series. Just the way he sort of susses his way through different issues and comes to the conclusions and actually can realize when, he's an inquisitor, so they torture people, when he realizes how the information sometimes is good, sometimes is bad, and he knows what the difference is between the two. It's fantastic. It actually adds a really solid layer of intelligence to his character. And overall, I just really enjoy the parts with him. He's an encapsulating character. You really want to sort of stick with him and actually see his whole process and everything he goes through and why he comes to the conclusions he does and what he's going to do. Because even if it seems like he's doing something semi-impulsively, usually he has thought several steps ahead, and seeing that play out is actually really cool. So it's kind of fun how you get three completely different stories woven into one, and I'm really excited to get into the third book and see how they all actually tie into each other. Because it's basically been the adventure, sort of D&D style story, a traditional fantasy war story, and a fantasy mystery thriller all rolled into one with characters that we've only seen them all come together once. I'm really curious to see what happens in the third book and see if they actually come together in a similar manner again. So Before They Hang, Joe Abercrombie, highly recommend it. And if you read the first book and you're just a little bit hesitant about the second one, get it, read it. I'm actually having trouble deliberately spacing and reading something else before I jump into the third book because my instinct is to just jump into the third one. That's how compelling it gets. And people mention that the first book that Abercrombie wrote was his weakest. And, a lot of the times online reading those kind of comments, it comes off like it's bad compared to the others. That is not the case. His first book is one of the best fantasy books I've read, and this one's better. So if he's showing consistent improvement this early on in his career, it makes me really excited that I have a whole bunch of books of his that I can slowly dig my way through. If you were here just for the review, at this point I'm just going to talk about the channel for a minute. So book review's done, let's switch gears for a moment. There are two books that I'll probably review together at some point, and that is Horror Store and My Best Friend's Exorcism. Just kind of accidentally read two books from the same author. They're interesting, so they'd make a good sort of pair up, but I might save them for later in the summer when we get closer to fall, because they are horror themed stories, even if they're a little bit campy. Probably would make a better review for that point. My current reading list is Dungeon Crawler Carl Part 2. So Carl's Doomsday Scenario. I have The Other's Eyes by J.W. Mobley to read. And I'm currently reading The Poisoner's Handbook. I don't know if any of you have actually read this. I'm reading this purely for my classes that I teach. I actually want to try to integrate a little bit of a novel sort of reading thing into my 10th grade chemistry classes to sort of reinforce English stuff, while at the same time also getting to have an excuse to talk about chemical structure for poisons. Seems like a fun way to integrate a little bit of real world history into the actual class. It's interesting so far. If you really like nonfiction, I would highly recommend it. Come off of a list of books that people actually recommended to use for high school science classes. So give it a browse. Other than that, I also have the first of the Tavern books from Destin J. Munden. I don't have the physical copy right now, but I'm reading through that because I want to read another of his books to put that review up. Those are all my TBRs at the moment, other than a few things that I'm reading on computer code just for the fun to learn it. And those are all things that'll be coming down the pipeline, of course, aside from the third book in this series, which I have it around here somewhere. I've got the physical copy of it already in, so that whenever I do the review, I don't have to handle the collector's edition of it. We'll do an unboxing review combo video for that one, but that's sort of the peak review video for the summer. Anyway, thank you for sticking around this long. Now you know what all's coming up. And I've got to figure out another game to replace Monster Hunter Stories with for the main channel. The main channel. And I've got to figure out another game to replace Monster Hunter Stories with for the gaming side of the channel. Anyway, have a good night, and thank you for listening.